Om Sahana Bhavatu Sahano Vunaktu Sahaviryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu Ma Vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May Brahman protect us, may he guide us and give us strength and right understanding. May love and harmony be with us all. Om peace, peace, peace. And good evening. We are reading from the complete works of Swami Ramakrishnananda, and we are going to begin a new section, I believe, right?
Sure.
How to be a real master. Go ahead.
When the blind king Dhritarashtra exhorted his favorite son Duryodhana to live contented with his kingdom, which had fallen to his share, with all those royal luxuries which followed him at every step, with his 100 brothers and innumerable relatives and friends, ready to die for him if necessary, and with his vigorous youth and great capacity for all earthly enjoyments, which flowed towards him from all directions more profusely than he could ever manage with, the answer that Duryodhana gave his fond parent clearly reveals the characteristic of the human mind. His reply was, "That mean-minded fellow is looking down upon the wise, who does not aspire to dignify himself simply because he has got good food and clothing. Contentment, vanity, mercy, and fear destroy all hope of prosperity. These qualities only disqualify a man to rule a kingdom, O Bharata. Man is born with a restless, discontented nature. Unlike the lower animals, he cannot rest satisfied with any limited amount of power, knowledge, or wealth, however vast that may be in its own way. Every man is aspiring to raise himself higher than where he is. A millionaire wants to amass more millions. A man well versed in all branches of knowledge does not rest satisfied, but wants more, wants to put his theories into practice. Absolute rest is gained only in the grave, says a Western thinker. Human life is indeed a constant struggle against whatever tries to impede its onward flow. Here perhaps some may object by saying that a lazy man hates such struggles. Therefore, he's an exception to the rule. But in sooth, a lazy man is much more active than a really active man. For an extremely active man can, at most, build a cottage in a few hours on solid ground, whereas a lazy fellow can build a castle in the air within a second. Bhagavan Sri Krishna says, no one can live for a moment without action. Every man has to act, involuntarily forced by his nature. In the case of a lazy man, the desire to enjoy better things does not cease. Passions and appetites have more dominion over him than over an active man. But he is so much overpowered by sloth that instead of endeavoring to gratify them, he somehow or other manages to live simply by imagining them. The wish to enjoy better, to know more, to be more, and more free from all impediments which prevent them from attaining those things which they ardently desire, to be more a master than a slave, is the one raging passion in all human beings.
You probably remember the old movie Brewster's Millions. It's probably been remade a few times too, where the uncle left his nephew this huge fortune. And in those days, after World War II, and I think it was something like $8 million, which in those days really was a huge fortune. And so the conditions where he had to spend $1 million before his 30th birthday, and the nephew wondered why he had this peculiar condition. There were all sorts of conditions on how he could spend it. He said, because he wanted to make sure that you were sick of spending money before you inherited the rest of it. He didn't want you to be a spendthrift. So that was an interesting twist on things. But it sort of brings to mind this dilemma that the more you have, it seems like the more you want. But the uncle wanted to make sure that just because he had a lot, he wasn't going to want more and want to spend more and waste it. So sort of an interesting twist on that psychology. But there are other things like that. People that get addicted to eating chocolate or something. Weight Watchers would have a thing where they would force you to eat plain unsweetened chocolate. And it doesn't really taste very good. It's pretty bitter. And so by forcing you to eat more unsweetened chocolate than you could possibly want, they tried to implant the idea that you really didn't want the chocolate. It was really the sugar you wanted, and the sugar you knew was bad for you. So strange things like that we have to do in order to convince ourselves that we really don't want just more and more and more of the same thing. We are, unfortunately, creatures of desire, and that's, of course, what Buddha always said, was you have to give up these desires in order to be free. So it's a difficult key, but that brings up this interesting point, how we tend to want more and more of things, and we have an appetite for all sorts of pleasures. And we often imagine that they're going to be better than they really are. And sometimes people will end up finally achieving something, and then they kind of say, gee, is that all there is to this? It wasn't all it was cracked up to be. So you work hard and hard and hard for something, and then you finally get it, and you think, well, okay, that wasn't all that interesting. But then something else distracts you, and you go on to some other thing that you think you're going to enjoy and try to pursue that. So the trick is to learn to enjoy what you have and not worry about the things you don't have. All right, let's go on.
Now, therefore, it is clear that to be a real master and not to be a slave is the one aim towards which all humanity is moving. The full or partial realization of this end depends upon the intensity of the desire as well as the effort to attain to it. No one wants to be put down or discomfited in any way. The masterly spirit in man always wants to assert itself. This shows that in our real nature, we are masters. Although circumstances have so much bound us hand and foot that we are compelled to believe that we depend on this thing or that thing, this man or that man for our existence. Still, we cannot help thinking that we are really masters. The slave in a court is master in his own house. The common servant of your house, drawing a very paltry sum every month, which is hardly enough to keep body and soul together, is a prince in his own cottage in a faraway wayside village. The intense bliss which he enjoys in the sweet smiles of his children and family, that passive mood of highest felicity in which he abandons himself when his little boys and girls lisp out to him all those sweet stories and incidents which they have gathered and learnt in his absence, and have been cherishing in their bosoms to impart to him, can in no way fall short of any enjoyments which fall to the lot of a monarch. Nay, in many cases, these natural enjoyments of his far surpass all those royal enjoyments which are more or less artificial.
Right, so that's the idea, is to be satisfied with the simple pleasures of life and not feel like you need to be treated like royalty and have all sorts of fancy things. You can be perfectly happy with a lot less than what a great monarch might have. And of course, the great monarchs always have the fear of losing it. That's the trouble. The more you have, the more you fear losing it. Other people are jealous and they want to take it away from you, and you have to hire guards and security. And in the old days, you'd put up moats with crocodiles, and then you had to feed the crocodiles. So all of these difficulties occur. So they've done studies with people that win the lottery too, and they find that their happiness briefly goes up after winning and then goes back down, usually to a lower level than they had before they won the lottery. They end up having too many relatives that all wanted to share, and even if you give them something, you didn't give them enough. You gave more to the other relative than you gave to me, and so then you end up with all sorts of jealousies and difficulties. And so, unfortunately, getting things that you think you wanted doesn't always lead to happiness. It also reminds me of the scene in Through the Looking Glass, where Alice is in a little, she goes into a little curio shop. And in the curio shop, the person in charge of the curio shop is a sheep, and the sheep is knitting out of her own wool. A very interesting metaphor for Maya, the Divine Mother, knitting this world out of her own fabric. And Alice is just absolutely enchanted by all the charming little curios in this delightful shop. But it seems like as soon as she focuses her attention on one, that one seems to kind of go fuzzy, and then something else looks more interesting, and her mind gets distracted to that. And then they take a little boat on take a ride on a little boat, and she sees scented rushes. And she says, "Oh, aren't those beautiful scented rushes?" And she goes and she harvests a few scented rushes and puts them on the bottom of the boat, and immediately sees another patch of scented rushes. And she doesn't notice that the ones on the bottom of the boat that she just picked have faded away and wilted, and they're no longer fresh and scented. And so that's the way we go through life, pursuing one pleasure after the other, which tend to fade away as soon as we collect them. But then we just get distracted by another one. Lewis Carroll had an amazing amount of insights into human nature when he wrote those books and incorporated them into a fanciful story. All right.
So however badly circumstanced we may be, the circumstances have no power to completely obliterate our naturally independent nature. We are sure to assert ourselves at some time or other. Surroundings merely hide our real nature from our view and force us to believe what we are not. The clouds may thicken and thicken. The sun may be removed from our sight for days and days together. Still, neither the clouds have any power to soil the sun in any way, as they are far, far away from it. Nor is the sun destined to lie hidden behind these layers of mist forever.
Yeah, and that reminds me of the rain we got. We've been so desperate for rain. Everyone was praying we'd get more rain. But then, of course, once we got it, then we had floods, and people were wishing for a sunny day, and when is it going to stop raining? We've had too much rain. So no matter what you get, we never seem to be satisfied. It never comes in exactly just the right amount. Okay.
Cuckoos do not know how to build their own nests. So when the season comes for them to lay their eggs, they search for the nest of a crow, where there are some newly laid eggs of the latter. In the absence of the crow mother, the cuckoo stealthily takes possession of the nest, destroys all the crow eggs, and lays her own in their place, which are exactly similar to those of the crow, and flies away. The mother crow comes and sees the same eggs, and not knowing that her own eggs have been destroyed, rests perfectly satisfied. Through her motherly care, those eggs are properly hatched, and in time, the young cuckoos burst out of them. The young cuckoo thinks the crow to be their mother, and the crow, too, thinks them to be her offspring. For some time, the cuckoos think themselves to be crows and move and associate with the crows. But within a few days, the nature of the cuckoo asserts itself, and at last, cuckoos become cuckoos and leave the company of crows. No circumstance, however unfavorable, is able to put down nature. Such is the case with men too. The man may be a slave to a brother man who regards himself as the master of the slave, but as we have seen, no man can be absolutely a slave. And it is also a fact that no tyrant can ever be a real master. Aesop was a slave, but he lives in his fables and rules and guides men through the moral path laid down by him, and is destined to live and rule as long as men will praise morality more than immorality, whereas his employer or master has long been swallowed up in the gulf of oblivion. This shows how a slave is a master, and a master a slave. Time lovingly carries Aesop on its head and presents him to all generations, and thus has become a slave to him. But his master has to share a completely different lot, inasmuch as the very same time, instead of serving him, has completely smashed him under its all-destroying feet, and thus put an end to him, so that no one now even knows his name.
That's so true, isn't it? Yeah, Aesop is very famous, and but nobody knows who his master was. And of course, I think what he's going to be getting at here is that we have to be the master of our own minds. And the desires that creep up in the mind, you have to decide, are you going to be a slave to the desires? Are you going to be a slave to your senses? Or are you going to be the master of your senses and decide which desires are really the ones that you need to go after and which ones you can really afford to pass up? Okay, let's see what he says.
These considerations clearly show that since it is our nature to rule, it is always better to give this nature full scope to develop itself, to evolve masters and not slaves of ourselves. It will be my duty to point out to you how that can be effected. From our very childhood, we hate restraint. No conventionalism, no formality, no etiquette, no manner can bind a child. The children of the world profess no religion, admit no restrictions, and therefore have no caste. They are all of them of the same caste, for their characters are always and everywhere the same. Now the question is, should we leave our children to do whatever they like, or by so doing, we give them perfect liberty, and thus virtually make them masters and not slaves to others? It is true that a child does not love restraint, but that does not prove that it is not restricted or circumscribed on all sides. Circumstanced as we are bound hand and foot in all directions.
Of course, various psychological experiments have gone on in education where they try to see if they can give more freedom to the children and so forth, and give more scope for their imagination and so forth. And some of those have some good effects where they find more creative things and so forth. But a lot of times it doesn't have a very good effect, that the children just end up not having any respect for people that have lived through things and have experiences that they could learn from. And they don't have any sense of scheduling or priorities or all of those good habits. So you can't just let children run around pursuing freedom, freedom, freedom without some sort of restraints, because they don't learn to be responsible citizens. And that just includes their giving freedom to their own desires again. And so there you go. They're going to be more of a slave to their own desires if you just let them run rampant and they don't think they have to answer to anybody, or they don't have to cooperate with other children. They don't have to do anything of that sort. So it's a very tricky situation that you have to do. You want to allow children to have some flexibility and how they manifest themselves, but you also have to give some guidelines and some restraints in order to guide them in the right direction. Any good teacher does that. They coach the student in order to bring out their own creativity and show them various guidelines and things, but they're not too restrictive so as to cut off their creativity. So it's a very fine line there, okay?
We may love liberty, but we have no liberty. We may love pleasure, but there's no pleasure for us which we can get without undergoing great labor, trouble, and pain. We may hate pain, but pain is the cheapest thing in the market of this world. We may hate it, but it will intrude on us without our consent. Such being the case, it will not be very safe to present a passive mood to all such intrusions. When pleasure is so rare a commodity, here it will not do for us to sit idly, for in that case we shall become a plaything of misery. We must struggle hard to put down this misery and court and win pleasure to our side, which we love so much. The human child is the most forlorn and helpless creature on this earth. And so if it is allowed to be left alone to itself, to do whatever it likes, is there any doubt that it will be kicked out of existence by those enemies ever on the alert to work woe? Enemies such as ignorance, hunger, thirst, cold, heat, physical and mental weaknesses, diseases, and lots of other things. When a child is incessantly under the watchful gaze of all these evildoers, and when it is itself unable to resist them, it is our duty to keep it in a place which is beyond their reach. As when mosquitoes are very rife, we save ourselves from them by drawing a curtain around us. Or when a plant is very young, we put a fence around it to save it from being pulled out by mischievous urchins or grazed by the cattle. So we should limit the liberty of a child to prevent its falling prey to the enemies mentioned just now. This is the reason why a child should be made to go through a course of strict discipline before he's allowed to have any liberty, and as he proves stronger gradually under such discipline, we can give him liberty more and more, little by little. When he's strong enough to resist all evils, to hold his own ground against all temptations and promptings of nature, he should be allowed full liberty. When the plant grows up to be a tree, it shelters lots of cattle from sun or rain, supplies them with its leaves and tender twigs to feed upon. Yet one of these could have grazed it out of existence when it was very young.
Yes, you wonder sometimes, animals sometimes don't seem to have much sense. You know, you want to save your plants and let them grow bigger so you have more to eat later, but most animals just eat as much as they can for the moment, and then they end up grazing things out of existence, as it says here. In the old days, when we weren't overpopulated with people, that wouldn't have been as much of a problem. But still, the cycle of life has gone on, where you see various animals, their population of the particular animals have gotten out of control, and they end up eating themselves out of existence. They overeat their resources, and then their population declines. And of course, there are many mathematical models of that kind of behavior as to how the amount of resources and the number of predators and the number of and the amount of food and so forth and the reproductive rate, and you can balance all those things and show when an ecological system is in balance and when it's not in balance. And our lives are kind of like that too, you could say, where if we pursue all of our desires at once, we become overloaded, we become burnt out, we become so exhausted we can't enjoy any of them. So you have to learn to balance all your priorities and make sure that you're not pursuing so many things at once that you can't enjoy a few things. All right.
So we see the efficacy of sending our children to school. The boy or girl may not like restraint of any kind, but that is necessary for his or her own safety and the attainment of future liberty and mastership. When a boy is made to go through a certain discipline in course of time, he becomes habituated to that, and that habit becomes his nature. At last, when at first appeared to him to be discipline and restriction, becomes part and parcel of his own nature. He does not hate it anymore, but rather finds that he cannot do without it. He then gets a character, and as all our strength lies in our character alone, that boy becomes strong to resist what may come in his way.
And of course, many parents deliberately send their children to very good schools, and those schools are considered very good because they have strict discipline and they have rules and they have homework, and they motivate the students to achieve a lot and not to waste time. And so it becomes very difficult to get into those good schools. And students want to get into the good schools because they know they'll get a good education and that they will be disciplined. We know that sometimes self-discipline isn't the easiest thing to do. And that's the difficulty with just giving a lot of freedom to very young children. They don't know how to self-discipline themselves yet. But a school gives that kind of discipline to the student. And so in some sense, it's a kind of self-discipline to choose going to those schools. And many times the students themselves want to get into the schools that give you a firm framework of how to achieve things well in life and not waste a lot of time. Okay.
If we want to be proof against all sorts of temptations, we must first have a character of our own. And that character can only be gained by sacrificing one's own liberty and forcing one's own self to go through a regular course of good discipline for a certain number of years. When the discipline will be natural to him, that is to say, when it will not appear to him as a tyrannical and detestable master, but rather a most loving friend, without whom he cannot do even for a moment, then he shall know that his character has been formed. So long as we have no decided preference for anything, we are at the mercy of our senses. So long as we have no ideal to follow, we will have to heed to the calls of our passions and appetites. A characterless man is an abject slave to all worldly enjoyments. Whatever appears to him to be pleasant at the first sight, that he will blindly follow without caring for the after effects, which may sometimes lead him even to death. Passions and appetites have been compared to the insatiable fire. The more fuel you put into it, the more lustily will it burn, the more fuel will it want. No one can appease the hunger of fire. Therefore, those who think that desires can be conquered through the gratification thereof labor under a great mistake. However, a man may stuff his stomach with all good and luxurious things, after the lapse of a few hours, it will crave for something more. There's no food here on this earth, eating which we shall hunger no more. There's no drink here, drinking which we shall thirst no more. Let us cite an example here to illustrate this insatiable nature of our passion.
Now, you know, if you're a student and in the evening you sit and think, oh, gee, should I go to the movies or should I sit here and study? Well, a lot of times if you haven't disciplined yourself, you're going to choose to go to the movie or go out with friends and have fun. And then the next day you kind of regret it because you're not prepared for your test. And so if you haven't formed a habit, then you think, oh, should I do this or do that? If you formed a habit to always study from, say, 8 to 10 o'clock in the evening or something, then you don't have to ask your question is, what should I do tonight? You know what you're going to do. You read the lives of famous people, and you find that many of them had very strict routines that they followed, and they did it deliberately and with their own self-control. Nobody was making them do this. They would get up and they would have a routine of, if they're a writer or a composer or some other occupation, they dedicate a certain amount of time to, say, their writing or whatever it is, and then they may take a walk, and then they might, have a meal, and then they might take a rest, and then they spend another work period, and it's all, they've outlined their whole day, and they don't sit around and think, well, what should I do now? They know what they're going to do now. They've scheduled their day, they've made it a routine, and it's very regularized, and it allows them to achieve a lot during the day by having this regular routine. Now, some of us are in positions where it's more difficult to have a regular routine because you have to answer to a lot of different people and a lot of different situations that come up, and then you have to learn to be flexible. If you end up being too rigid with your routine, then it's difficult to be of service to the people that come at odd times with requests. So there's a balance there as well. But it is interesting that if you have that kind of freedom to be self-disciplined, that's an interesting one, a freedom to be self-disciplined, there's a great advantage to that. And of course, this is something that then carries over into our spiritual life. If we can have a definite routine of doing japa or meditation or both at a particular time, a couple times a day, and you build that into your routine, then it's easy to do. If you think, well, gee, do I have any time to meditate, or is there anything else I should be doing, then you'll probably think of 3 other things that you should be doing and end up not getting the time to meditate. So we have to be disciplined in spiritual life. And of course, spiritual life is one of those things where the benefit can be rather immediate, but it might not be for a long time. Some people do experience a great peacefulness from the very beginning, or after a certain period of regular practice, they begin to feel that great peace and calmness and joy that comes with a regular spiritual practice. But if it doesn't come right away, it takes a lot of discipline to keep at it and keep at it and keep at it until that time comes. Okay.
In olden days, there was a king whose name was Jayata. One day he went out to hunt. Following a deer, he was led away into the heart of a forest. All his retinue fell far back, and he was altogether left alone in that deep forest. The sun had passed the meridian line, and he felt himself thirsty. So wanting to drink some water, he cast his eyes in all directions to find out a well or a pond where therefrom he might quench his thirst. Going a little further, he discovered a well. He was very glad to hurry towards it so that he might slake his thirst the sooner. But what was his astonishment In the place of water he was in quest of, he saw a beautiful, half-clad, helpless maiden, weeping in utter dejection of spirit. He forgot his thirst in her distress and was anxious to rescue her from that dark den. He let down a cloth and told her to catch hold of it. She did so and was at once pulled out of the well. In inquiry, he learned that she, Devyana, was the daughter of the great sage Yukacharya, the guru of the Daityas, and that she was reduced to that plight by the wicked daughter of the king of the Daityas, named Sarmista. Hearing this, the king led her to her father, who, hearing the wickedness of the daughter of his disciple, at once called him to his presence and told him all about the mischief of his daughter, and also threatened him that unless his own daughters were propitiated by him, he would go away from his kingdom that very moment. The king of the demons did not want to lose so great a sage, and so he wanted to know what it was that could conciliate Devyana, at which Devyana said that if his daughter would consent to be her handmaid, the rest of her life she would be appeased. The king agreed to it, and Sarmista was accordingly given as a handmaid to Devyana. Now the goddess of Yayati was rewarded by Sukracharya by uniting him with Devyana, and the married couple, with their handmaid, went to their own kingdom. In course of time, Devyana had 2 children from him. As they were one day walking in the garden, 3 other beautiful children came running and addressed Yayati as their father. At this, Devyana wanted to know who they were. The king began to stammer. Devyana, after proper inquiry, came to know that they were her husband's own children by her handmaid. This highly enraged her. Without caring to take leave of her husband, she at once made for her father's abode and told all about Yayati's secret love. Shukracharya fondly loved his daughter, and so when he came to know her distress, he cursed Yayati to be overpowered with old age that very moment. Yayati lost his youth and became an ugly-looking, powerless old man, full of unsatiated desire. He craved pardon for his offense, and Shukracharya, taking pity upon him, gave him the power of exchanging his old age with the youth of any of his children who would be willing to do so. One after another, he asked all his children. All failed to comply with the request, except the last one, whose name was Puru. Puru gave his youth to his father and took his old age instead. With the youth of his child, the king enjoyed all sorts of pleasures for 1,000 years. But at last he found out that his desire for further enjoyment had not abated a little on that account, and his experience taught him that desires are insatiable. So he took back his old age from his child, returned the latter's youth to him. The celebrated sentiment which he expressed on that occasion is known to all good people, even at the present day. He said that the desires are in no way allayed by enjoyments, but rather increase more and more, even as fire grows by being fed with clarified butter.
Oh, yeah. Remember, I had a song to that effect, where the desires increase as you put, as putting oil on fire. And so that in itself, though, is the lesson that shows you that the desires really aren't all they're cracked up to be. They just cause more problems than they solve. So in some sense, eventually, they burn themselves out, you could say. You end up finding that you can't. There aren't any things that will satisfy your desires, and so you are able to give up, like this old man was. Interesting how long they lived back then. The son was still hasn't died from his old age when they were able to change back. Okay, so it's...
This life history of Yayati clearly proves that if we follow the dictates of our senses, we shall never be able to please them. It is not only fruitless to serve a master who is hard to please, but also it's very dangerous to serve him. He will never allow you to take a moment's rest, but every hour of the day you will have to be a slave to him. No rest can such a slave ever expect to have. Such an abject being can never hope to be a master. Unfortunately, most all human beings are such slaves. There are very few, if any, here in the world who do not move at the beck and call of their passions and appetites. Now we've known the danger, and it's our duty to avoid it. He is regarded doubly a fool who, once suffering from a burn, again thrusts his finger willingly into the fire. And are we not all doing the same thing every moment of our life? Naturally, we all want to be masters, but foolishly we become slaves of our senses. Our natural aspiration to be masters is always kept dead drunk and dormant with the new wine of contact born, pleasure freighted with the misery. Thus we always forget our goal and love to wallow in the mire of false pleasure.
Well, that's kind of like the parable of the two birds in the tree, and the one bird is eating of the fruits of the tree, and some of them are sweet and some of them are bitter. But the bird at the top of the tree, representing the Paramatman, the Supreme Self, has already realized the Supreme Self as the source of all joy and bliss, and sits regally at the top. But the lower bird keeps hopping around searching for more pleasures. And so it gets one that's pretty good, and then another one is not so good. And then you got to get that taste out of your mouth. So then you try another one. And hopefully that one is better tasting, and you find one that does get the bitter taste out of your mouth. And you get a few of those, and you get encouraged. And then you get a few really rotten ones that are just sickening, and you get kind of sick from those. So then you have to wait a while before you look around for some more sweet ones. And eventually you keep looking up and seeing that nice blissful bird at the top, and you realize he's got something going for him that I don't have. He's not jumping around getting good and bad experiences one after the other. Maybe I should pursue his mode of living instead of the one I've got here. And so that's kind of our situation here, is we keep trying to find pleasures in life, and sometimes we're lucky and we get a few good pleasures in life, but they're usually followed by some sort of disappointment. And so then you have to try to get over the disappointment, and you end up pursuing different pleasures, and perhaps even kind of drowning yourself in different pleasures. And then eventually you have to come to the conclusion that this isn't working. And so this is the way our life goes. We can't seem to convince ourselves early enough on that pleasure seeking is not necessarily the goal of life. It seems to be what makes the world go around, isn't it? So it's very difficult to fight that inclination. As we've mentioned before, our genes program us to survive, and part of that survival mechanism is seeking out things that are good for us. And so we are constantly on the look for things that will help us survive, and things that are pleasurable: good food and good shelter, good mates. And so we pursue those things. But that's our genetic programming, and our true self is beyond the genetic programming. It's the Supreme Self. And so we have to realize that the automatic programming that we have isn't necessarily going to serve our highest purpose. All it's going to do is serve us to get along in the world so that we can have kids that are going to go through the same problem. So we have to remember that we need to rise above our genetic programming, because our true self is not just a genetic organism. We are a spiritual being. We're the Atman that's inhabiting a genetically programmed organism. And so we want to break free of that. All right, so we will continue this discussion next week. And next week, remember, there is no in-person meeting. It'll only be online. And so please join us online next Friday for probably what will be the conclusion of this particular chapter. All right, we'll close with a chant. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Filled with Brahman are the things we see. Filled with Brahman are the things we see not. From out of Brahman floweth all that is. From Brahman all, yet is it still the same. Om, peace, peace, peace.